Hello, everyone, and welcome to Encounter Church. My name is Sam. I'm the hospitality director here, and I just want to welcome you to our digital worship experience. This is something we put together every weekend so you can encounter God wherever you are. We'll begin shortly with a message from the scriptures, followed by worship. So we encourage you to stick around after the sermon to join us in worship. But for now, let's listen to this week's message.
What's the kindest thing somebody's ever done for you? Years ago, when I had just gotten out of college, I was working at an insurance agency, and I was trying to honestly get started in seminary. That was kind of like my dream, and I just couldn't afford it. I had no idea how I was going to be able to do it. And the church I was working at the time, somebody from the church decided to sponsor my first year of seminary. They basically set up a scholarship for me. I had really nothing to deserve that from them. They just really believed in me, and they thought I should do that, and they wanted to help me get started. It took me like 10 years to finish seminary, but I managed to do it last year, and I always carry that with me, right? Like at this moment in my life where, like, I'll be honest, like prospects seem a little bit bleak, like it was coming out of the '08 financial crash. I know it was going to do with my life, and this person kind of like, had some belief in me, and and just had this random act of generosity and kindness that set my life on a different trajectory, and I always carry that with me, and maybe you've been recipient of kindness. Maybe it wasn't kindness like that, maybe it was, and like somebody did something really kind, really generous for you that kind of change things, and I want you to remember for a second how you felt when you received that kindness. Kindness is one of those things that when we experience that, you just feel this profound sense of gratitude. I also argue that we live in a world right now that struggles with kindness, right? Like last year was a fascinating Rorschach test of who we are, because on one side we saw some of the most selfless acts of kindness, and you just look at that and you say, man, humanity is like, we've got it. We'll use a sacrifice at the moment of like the most profound crisis. We'll sacrifice for each other. We'll do whatever it needs to be done to take care of each other. And then the subsequent months, you can also present an image of some of us doing some of the most selfish and hateful acts that we can think about. Our country became profoundly polarized, and I would argue harsh, and I would argue violent against each other, which is kind of like all the opposite things from kindness. And I'm bringing this up because this week we are looking, you guessed it, at kindness as one of the fruits of the Spirit, and we're journeying through these 9 these character traits that we find in the book of Galatians, that the Apostle Paul says, when somebody is walking with God, when the Spirit of God is working in somebody, these are the 9 things that you're going to start noticing on people's lives. And that's on Galatians chapter 5, starting on verse 22. And I just read up to where we're at right now. So Galatians 5:22 says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which is another word for patience, and kindness. And so far we've taken a look at love and joy and peace and patience, and today we're going to turn our attention towards kindness. And I think it's interesting because so far we've looked at some what we call like big virtues, right? Think about love and joy and peace, and I think that these are things that we will all probably agree that are huge core virtues for all of humanity, right? I don't think I would meet anybody that would say, hey, I don't want love, or I don't want joy, or I don't want peace, right? These are core things that we all strive to possess, and to a certain degree we all strive to experience, to feel, right? So it makes sense that Apostle Paul would start pointing out to those big qualities. But starting last week, we kind of like took a little bit of a turn, and we've been looking at this other section of the fruit of the Spirit that I would argue, in everyday life, some of us see as good things, but we don't maybe see them as necessary things that we all need to have. And what I mean by that is that I've never heard somebody say, I'm just not a loving person, or just not a person that has experienced love, or that wants love, or that desires love. They might not love everybody, but they love some people. And the same thing I would say with joy and with peace. Like, this is something that even if people don't have, people want. And I think that the reason for that is because we tend to think about these characteristics not only as things for us to do for others, but as things that we would like to experience, to feel. We all want to feel love and joy and peace. But I'll tell you something. I've heard much more often people say, well, I'm just not a patient person. And I've also heard people say, like, I'm not like the kindest person. I'm not super kind. I can be kind all the time. Or maybe another way of looking at that is that, I have heard people, referencing to other people as kind, almost like as a sort of an anomaly, right? Like it's not the norm to be so kind. So when somebody's really kind, it kind of like stands out and it feels very remarkable. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of those like, random acts of kindness campaigns that are like, like you follow a nonprofit or some business on Instagram. I think we did something like that last year. It's like, typical thing, like do a random act of kindness, maybe, pay for the coffee of the person behind you at the line or something like that. And what makes those acts of kindness random is what? It's the fact that it's not something that you do all the time. It's something that because it's not something that people normally do, then it kind of like calls out attention when it's done. And all of this makes super interesting the fact that the Apostle Paul includes kindness as a part of the fruit of the Spirit. Because what that implies is that for Christians, kindness isn't an anomaly or shouldn't be an anomaly. Kindness should be the norm, that as we walk with Jesus and as the Spirit of God works in our lives, that we should become some of the kindest people on earth, which is, ironic because if there was one thing that happened last year is that, so many Christians became known not for their kindness, but honestly for the cruelty. This week here in DC, the mayor is reinstated the indoor mask mandate. And I'll be honest with you, for me, one of the most heartbreaking things as a pastor has been to see the tone of the responses of people. Not only Christians in the pews, but pastors and leaders who disagree with those mandates. Just this week, there was a clip going viral on Twitter of some pastor that, was yelling from the pulpit that if someone would show up to his church wearing a mask, he would kick him out. And my problem is that, whatever your position is in a mask mandate, whether you agree or disagree, it is the tone with which we communicate that position. It's confrontational and offensive and derisive how we talk to people who we disagree on an issue. And maybe that's not you, right? Like maybe you're totally cool wearing masks indoors and this is not a problem for you, but maybe the way in which your family member from home who are different than you or who thinks different than you is also less than kind. Maybe, after being, indoors in love with the same people in your family, your natural tone of how you talk to them, how you react is less than kind. Like your patience is run so thin that now the first little thing that they do kind of like sets you off. And anything, I think that at the core of that is that we actually don't think that kindness is that important. We don't think that it's such a big deal. We think it's kind of like an extra that, hey, if we get to be kind, that's fine. But, how can people possibly expect me to be kind with the type of people that I'm dealing with? And some of us even like rationalize it. Like we say, yes, we're called to love our neighbors and we're called to love our enemies too, by the way. That's what Jesus says. But we can make that love very abstract, right? Like we will use phrases, for example, like tough love, right? And part of the problem is that right now in our country, like the way that, the fault lines ideologically and politically and culturally are set, the actions of beliefs of one group have actually, historically harmed other groups. And that must be confronted and resisted and spoken out against. I'm not fuzzy on that. But there's a line that crosses from, opposing harmful rhetoric or behavior or ideologies or policy positions that crosses into something different. And I would say that something different is unkindness. And I fear that sometimes we sort of like that, that we don't just want to speak against a harmful idea. We want to ridicule the other person. And what we do is that, when we do that, we're not being loving. We're actually using love as an excuse to be unkind. Or maybe another way to say it is like we're using love as an excuse to be cruel or even sometimes violent. And the question is, if kindness is so important and so central to who Jesus is, because remember, a working thesis that all of these characteristics point us back to Jesus, that this is what Jesus looks like. And if that's the case, then how can we recover the importance of kindness? And I think that the place that we start is that we have to see God as a kind God. Remember that all through the Spirit, one of the things that we believe is that they have their origin in God. That God is, if the fruit of the Spirit is kindness, that means that God is somehow kind. But it doesn't only mean that God is somehow kind. It means that God is the source of kindness. And for many of us, even Christians, we have a little bit of a fractured vision of who God is, right? But the problem is that the Bible describes so many different characteristics of God. And if you grew up in the church, you've heard so many different sermons about so many of the elements and attributes of God: His sovereignty, His power, His love, His justice, His holiness, and His kindness. And most of us have a hard time reconciling all those qualities together, so we make them competing qualities. And what ends up happening is that we end up seeing God, primarily through the lens of the one characteristic that either we've experienced or the one characteristic that, we've been impressed on by our leaders or pastors or whoever, that is what God is like. And what ends up happening then is for many of us, like, we see God primarily, if we see God, only as, say, holy, we think that somehow God's holiness is in competition with His kindness. Like, because God is holy, God should always, be in a state of like anger and wrath towards our sin. And it's hard for us to see God actually as a kind God. Some of us, because of our experience of God, we see God a lot of times it's kind of like aloof. Like, we don't experience Him in our lives. So we think of God is like this distant God. Some of us think that God is a harsh God. And even if we're Christians, we might believe in Jesus cognitively and believe that God loves us because, He sent Jesus. But even then, there's a divide between the idea of God's love for our salvation versus what our daily experience of God is. And the thing is that the vision of the Scriptures of who God is over and over points towards God being a kind God. In the Old Testament, the word that the Old Testament uses for kindness is the word hesed. And if you've heard me preach about this before, the word hesed actually is also translated oftentimes in the Old Testament as the word love. And so what you see in a lot of the new translations, whenever the word love, the word hesed is used, they will use this combination of words and they will call it steadfast love or loving kindness. The best example of that is like the passage that we looked at last week in Exodus 34, when God is revealing Himself to Moses and God is describing Himself, and He starts saying, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And then He goes on and on. When He says, slow to anger, abounding in love, that love line is actually loving kindness. Is the word hesed. He's saying that it's abounding in a type of love that is kind. And the Old Testament combines kindness with love. And I don't think that's just a linguistical quirk or accident of the text. I think that actually they're trying to make a point that the type of love that God has, the kindness of God that God has, they're used interchangeably because they're connected. And we see that all throughout the Old Testament. Probably one of the best examples is in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is reminding the people after the exile how God treated Israel in the desert. In the passage, for example, in Exodus that we just read. And Nehemiah says in Nehemiah chapter 9, starting on verse 16, he says, "But they, your ancestors, became arrogant and stiff-necked, and they did not obey your commands. They refused to listen and failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked and in their rebellion appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. Therefore, you did not desert them. Even when they cast for themselves an image of a calf and said, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt," when they committed awful blasphemies. That line, he's actually echoing back to the Exodus passage, right? You're a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, abounding in hesed, abounding in loving kindness. God's love, I think that what the Old Testament is saying is that God's love is expressed as kindness. Which means that if we're called to love our neighbors and our family and our friends and also our enemies, that means that we cannot so easily separate this idea of love as an abstract concept with how that love is expressed. And apparently, for God, that love is expressed in kindness. One of the ways in which God expresses his love is through kind of the same thing, by the way, is true in the New Testament. There's a passage in the book of Titus, Titus chapter 3, says, "At one time, we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another." But he says this, "But when the kindness and love of God," the kindness and love is connecting the two terms, kindness and love of God's Savior appeared, he saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy. What God is saying in the Exodus passage, what Nehemiah is reinstating in the Nehemiah passage, what Titus is saying, and by the way, I'm just using these three as an example because there's tons of them. What they're saying is that because God is love, we don't have to talk God into being kind. And here's the interesting part. God in the Bible is kind to everyone. He's not only kind to Christians, he's not only kind to the people of God. Actually, the Bible goes out of the way to kind of describe God as a God that's kind to everybody. The Gospel of Luke, this is Jesus talking. Jesus says this. Luke chapter 6, verse 32 says, if you love those who love you, well, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect payment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be repaid in full. And then Jesus says, but love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Listen to this. Because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. What Jesus is saying is that God's default is kindness. And by the way, this doesn't mean that God doesn't judge sin. It doesn't mean that God isn't holy. We've talked about this in the past. We've talked about it again in the future. But what I'm trying to say is that the Bible goes out of the way to present God as a God who's fundamentally kind to everybody. Not only Christians, not only those who behave the right way, not only those who somehow can earn, if that was a possibility, which is not God's kindness. God is just naturally kind. Which then leads us to the next question, right? If God's default is kindness, we all have been we are recipients of God's kindness, which takes me to the next thing. Like, how do we recover the importance of kindness? Well, it's only that we have to see God as a kind God, but we have to see ourselves as people who have experienced kindness, people who have received kindness. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, kind of like his big opus on justification and how exactly does the death of Jesus save people. He says this in Romans chapter 2, starting on verse 1. He says, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." Now, we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness? Forbearance, by the way, it's also connected to patience, and then not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance. What he's saying is this, saying anybody that's actually become a Christian has experienced the kindness of God. The only way we come to repentance, the only way we come to Jesus is because of God's kindness. If you connect that with the last passage that Jesus says, the guy is kind to the wicked and the ungrateful. What he's saying is that God's really, people are alive. People have experienced God's kindness. And a lot of times the problem is that we don't necessarily feel like that, right? Like a lot of times it feels like, so a lot of us, we've had rough lives. We've gone through rough patches and we cannot possibly feel like, okay, how is this God's kindness? And one of the things that the scriptures is kind of like give us this broad perspective of things that a lot of times we don't think they're related to us, but they are. And one of the reasons why we point back to the death of Jesus on the cross every Sunday when we gather and we celebrate communion. It's precisely because we need to be reminded that that's part of our story too. Maybe we didn't realize we need it, but we need it, and maybe we weren't there. But Jesus, when he died, had us in mind. What it means is that we are the recipients of the most profound act of kindness that it's ever done. And a lot of times, what Paul seems to be saying is like, a lot of times when we become judgmental with other people, or talking about in the case of this example of kindness, when we become unkind, we become short, and we become angry with people. Part of the problem is that we are forgetting about God's kindness. That the more that we forget, we've been recipients of kindness, the easier it becomes then to be unkind to other people. And how do we keep from forgetting that we're the recipients of kindness? Well, apparently, according to Paul, is that we have to continue to receive the kindness of God. And one of the things that means is that just opening our eyes and becoming aware of the fact that every day we are recipients of God's kindness. Every day that you wake up with breath in your lungs, you are receiving God's kindness. Our dog Corby, some of you know him, he ate a cob of corn this past week. We won't talk about how that happened, but it happened. And we freaked out because they say that that can cause a blockage and, you could die. It's a serious thing. So we take him to the emergency vet, had to spend all night parked outside because of COVID, I couldn't go in. So I'm waiting outside for him. I had to bring him the next day, spend the whole morning there. And one of the things that moments like that, it's like a silly thing, right? Because the dog ate a cup of corn. But one of the things that does is that at some moment when we're realizing how serious this could get is that, man, we could lose Corby. And we love that dog. and the next couple of days, we're making fun of him because he ate it, and we're telling him bad dog. But at the same time, I'm so incredibly grateful that they have him with me. Now, he's always been with me, since we got him. It just, because I was made aware that I could lose him, my gratitude, my awareness of how much of a gift is to our lives increases. And a lot of times that's what we need to do. We need to just open our eyes to the kindness of God that we've always had around us. We just don't have eyes to see because we're focusing on other things. So the practice that can bind us to that is gratitude. Is continuously, practicing gratitude, thanking God for something in our lives, because that makes us aware that we're actually, even when things might not look great all the time, that we are recipients of God's kindness. Which is the next thing, in that passage in Romans, Paul is using kindness in the context of God's grace, right? God saved us, his kindness led us to repentance, that through his kindness, God saved us when we didn't deserve it. But part of what Paul is saying is that kindness is a gift from God. That kindness is not something that we earn. It's something God gives. Which brings me to the next point. That's we need to see kindness not only as a privilege that people earn. People don't have to earn the right for you to be kind to them. But if kindness is God's default posture towards the world, then if we are the people of God, then kindness should be our default posture towards the world. Remember how we said that kindness was God's default? Well, the question is, what is our default, right? Because for a lot of us, our default is not kindness. It might be something like tolerance, right? We wake up and people should be grateful that we're not yelling at them all the time, because if they had all idea of what we're dealing with, we would just unleash. For some of us, our default is some form of tolerance, that I don't kill the people in my house. For some, our default is just annoyance. We wake up and we're just annoyed. And we're just waiting for somebody to do the literacy so we can fly off the handle and yell at them. some of us, if we're honest, our default is aggression. Like we wake up, normally I wake up angry. And that kind of like leaks out into how we connect and relate to others. For so many of us, our default is not kindness. And if you realize what's happening there is that so much of how we treat others is made subject to external circumstances, to our mood, to how other people are acting. And God, if kindness is God's default, one of the things that we're learning is that God works the opposite way, that God, regardless of how people are, God's default is always to show kindness. A lot of us, we have been shaped by the way we were brought up, by our upbringing, by what we experience from parents or caregivers. And some of us did not receive or experience kindness. So it's so hard for us to kind of like go there naturally. And one of the ways in which we combat that is that we have to give up on the idea that people must earn our kindness. And what happens is that the more that we realize, how much of God's kindness we're constantly recipients of, the easier it should be then to see others in the same light as people who need kindness, who are also recipients of God's kindness. And now that we get to extend our kindness and through our kindness, God's kindness to them, right? Now, the final thing is that I will say this, is that in so many of this, fruit of the Spirit that we've been looking at, one of the things that I'm trying to be sensitive to is that, I know stories of people that have undergone profound abuse and trauma and abuse of power and people taking advantage of things. Like in our country, in the world, really, there's been a reckoning of that in the last few years. And it's very easy to see passages like this, primarily through the lens of like another tool for abusers to keep getting ahead, right? So you're called to be kind, even though somebody's taking advantage of you, somebody's hurting you. And I want to say, like, first of all, like that's, the Bible has a much more breadth to talk about human relationships than just this particular vision. And the Bible talks about justice, and the Bible talks about, standing up for the oppressed and the weak. So it's not, don't just limit yourself to that. But I also want to show you this, that kindness is not a weakness that abusers can be exploit. Kindness is actually strength. I don't know if you remember in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most famous things that Jesus talks about is the idea of turning the other cheek, right? Like I'll read that's a passage in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. It says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." And this passage is very famous, and a lot of us say, like, I can't turn the other cheek when we're talking about, not being able to just not fight back. And sometimes this passage kind of like shows us weird things of like just kind of like just let people roll over you. Now, what you know is like in the context, this passage is actually it's revolutionary. It's very interesting because part of Jesus like alluding to a couple things. One of those things, for example, when you were slapped, like normally people, if you were slapped on the right cheek, right, like that meant that somebody was using the right cheek as well, the right hand to slap you on your right cheek. And in the Jewish culture, the left hand was the hand that you used to wipe yourself after you use the bathroom. So it was seen as this dirty hand that you couldn't use for anything else. And it was like an offense that you would use your left hand. And when you say, well, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek, part of what you're saying, well, if you offer the other cheek, you're kind of like forcing them to use their other hand to slap you. And when they use that hand, they are the people that are in the wrong. You're exposing because that somebody would slap you with their dirty hand was like the most offensive thing they can do. All of a sudden, who becomes the offender? The guy that's slapping. The idea of if somebody's, if somebody wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Well, in the Jewish law, there was a law, you go back to the Old Testament, that you couldn't take somebody's coat because you could not leave somebody exposed to the elements and the cold. So if you're giving your coat, even though they can't take your coat, all of a sudden, who's on the offense? And the offense is the person that's asking for the coat. He says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. There was a law at the time that a Roman soldier could pick up anybody and force them to carry their backpack and their stuff for 1 mile. And they could do it for more than 1 mile. 1 mile is all they could demand. If you go for 2 miles, all of a sudden, who's abusing? The guy that's making you carry their stuff for more than they should. Do you see what's saying? The whole passage is incredibly subversive. And what Jesus is saying is kindness. It's not weakness. Kindness is actually strength. Because kindness exposes unkindness. Kindness is an act of resistance. If you remember, one of the most famous passages on this idea is in the book of Romans. It's the Apostle Paul talking. And he says this. Romans chapter 12, verse 14 says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. And then he says this, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul goes into this long passage about how we actually oppose evil. And it's all kindness. It's like the way in which evil is fought. It's kind of, and this is the problem. That a lot of you are thinking in terms of like national geopolitics and saying that's not how the real world works. And the problem is that most of the time that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about interpersonal relationships. That most of the time when we talk about this, it's not about some, country with nuclear weapons. It's about your neighbor. It's about your friend. A lot of times it's about your spouse or your family member or your dad or your mom or your sister or brother or your children. Where a natural tension because of everything that's happened to us and everything they've done is to be unkind. And somehow we see our unkindness as a way of like pressuring them into change or expressing our frustration or whatever. And part of what I think Jesus is saying, Paul is saying, is like the more you do that, the more the relationship is going to deteriorate and deteriorate and deteriorate and deteriorate. And if all you want to do is win, if all you want to do is show them they're wrong, then go ahead, keep doing that. But if you want to salvage that relationship, if you would like to have a peaceful relationship, your unkindness is not going to do it. Paul says it's kindness that leads us to repentance. So my prayer for us today is that we would become people of kindness. That the more that we're aware of how God has been with us, that we will become people who extend that kindness to others. So this week, my brothers and sisters, may you feel and experience and become aware of the kindness that God has shown for you. Not only in sending his son to die for your sins and save you, but in everything that you experience every day, in the air that's in your lungs, in the health that you have, the people around you. And may that motivate you to become kind, to make kindness your default on how you treat the people around you, the people that you love, the people you don't love. That you will become known for your kindness, grace, and peace.
Hello again. We hope that this message was a blessing to you and is helpful on your faith journey. If this is your first time joining us, or maybe you've joined us for a few times before and are looking to get involved further, we would love to connect with you. We have a digital connection card. You can go to encounterdc.com/connect. For every connection card we receive, we set aside some money to do some good in our community. We also have a special gift for you for filling out a card. You can share as much or as little information as you like, ask us any questions, and find out how you can get involved in the life of the church. I also want to thank everyone who supports Encounter through your generosity. Your giving allows us to do everything we do, from serving our community to creating content like this. If you'd like to give, you can go to encounterdc.com/give. You can make a one-time gift, or you can set up recurring giving. And now we encourage you to join us for worship. We invite you to listen, sing along, or use this time to just sit and reflect. Our hope is that you can experience God's presence during this time. So if you will, please join us in worship.
I'm leaning on the everlasting arms that place me on the rock that stands. I hold true to the one who breaks my fall and lifts me time and time again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. This freedom purchased by the highest price, this grace outweighing all my shame. I'm made new through the power of sacrifice, from death now raised to life again. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. I'm singing, you are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good, when you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good, so I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing, you are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good. When you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good. So I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are good. Oh my God, so good. You never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. Oh my God, so good, you never give up on me. Oh, what joy I found because of your love for me. I'm not a slave to sin, so I'm singing, you are good, buried with Christ to rise in your freedom. You are good, when you make a promise, Jesus, you keep it. You are good, so I'll praise your name as long as I'm breathing. You are
peace fills the night. Raise my head up to hear the sound. Though fires burn around me, I will praise you, my God. And the foxes in the vineyard will not steal my joy, because you are good to me, good to me. You are good to me, good to me. You are good to me, because you are good to me, good to me. You are good to me, good to me. You are good to me. You are so good, Lord. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. We declare your goodness and mercy shall follow me all my life. I trust in your promise. Your goodness and mercy shall follow me all my life. I trust in your promise. Your goodness and mercy shall follow me all my life. I trust in your promise. Your goodness